Jim Larson lay on his hospital bed, a shadow of his former self. Memories flashed before his eyes like a slideshow of regret. Was it all worth it? Suddenly, Dr. Victoria Taylor stood in the doorway, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun. The emaciated frame that once held Jim upright now seemed to sink under its own weight of decay. A window into a world of deceit and corruption? Jim's body was failing him, muscles weakened, organs struggled. But his mind remained sharp, haunted by the nagging question, was it all worth it? The very technology meant to improve lives was being used to manipulate and control them. With each breath, he steeled himself for the confrontation to come, a battle that would decide not only his fate, but also the lives of countless others. Jim's life was already hanging by a thread, but now it seemed like he had no choice but to take an even bigger gamble. The weight of his responsibilities settled upon him like a shroud as he turned off his device, knowing full well what the road ahead would entail. "You'll regret this, Jim Larson," Dr. Taylor spat before storming out of the room. Like and subscribe for more stories like this one. Jim Larson lay on his hospital bed, his body a shell of its former self. 60 years old, with a lifetime of successes and failures etched into his weathered face. The emaciated frame that once held him upright now seemed to sink under the weight of its own decay. As he stared up at the sterile white ceiling, memories flashed before his eyes like a slideshow of regret, business deals gone sour, failed relationships. Despite the bleakness of his situation, Jim's mind remained sharp, and in those lucid moments, he was haunted by a nagging question. Was it all worth it? Suddenly, a gentle touch on his shoulder broke his reverie. "Jim, can I come in?" Dr. Victoria Taylor stood in the doorway, her long blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun. "Of course," Jim replied, mustering a weak smile. Dr. Taylor entered, pulling up a chair beside him. Her eyes, a piercing blue, held an unmistakable glint of curiosity and concern. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, her voice warm but professional. Jim sighed, the effort it took to speak almost too much for his frail body. "The same," he admitted, "but I've been thinking." He paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "About the trial." "Which one?" Dr. Taylor leaned forward, her attention piqued. "The neural implant," Jim said quietly. "I know it's experimental, but might it help me, even now?" His voice cracked on the last word. The doctor's expression softened. "Jim, you've been a perfect candidate thus far. The technology holds immense promise for treating degenerative diseases like yours." She placed her hand over his, her touch reassuring. "Would you like to proceed?" Jim hesitated, weighing the risks against any potential benefits. But something about Dr. Taylor's words and the hope they ignited within him convinced him that he had nothing left to lose. "I'm in," he said finally, a resolute determination settling into his eyes. Dr. Taylor nodded, her smile radiant with excitement. "Excellent choice. I'll schedule you for surgery as soon as possible." As the doctor exited the room, Jim felt a glimmer of hope flicker within him. Perhaps this final gamble would pay off, and he could leave something meaningful behind when his time finally ran out. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the weariness that enveloped him once more. Little did he know, his decision was only the beginning of an odyssey into the darkest recesses of human greed and deception, a journey that would test his courage, his convictions, and ultimately change the course of history forever. Jim drifted in and out of consciousness as he recovered from the surgery, his mind hazy with pain medication and exhaustion. When he finally emerged from his medicated fog, he found himself ensconced in a private hospital room, Dr. Taylor sitting beside him. She beamed proudly at his progress. She explained, her voice tinged with excitement. The initial tests indicate it's functioning within normal parameters. Jim's head spun with questions, but he could only manage to croak out a few words before growing weak again. Dr. Taylor patiently answered each query in turn, reassuring him that he was on the mend and would soon regain his full strength. As the days passed, Jim slowly regained his vigor. The hospital staff monitored him closely, tracking his progress with the implant. He noticed something peculiar, however, a subtle hum beneath his thoughts, as if an external presence had taken up residence within his mind. At first, he dismissed it as a side effect of the medication, but the sensation persisted even after he'd been weaned off the drugs. One evening, while Jim was browsing through old photos on his tablet, he experienced another strange episode. Suddenly, he found himself immersed in a vivid memory that wasn't his own, a scene of people frantically discussing numbers and timelines in a dimly lit conference room. As quickly as it appeared, the recollection vanished, leaving behind only an unsettling feeling. Jim's thoughts raced with confusion and curiosity. Was this some unforeseen consequence of the implant? Were these memories somehow being transmitted to him? Crimes in progress. The more he delved into their significance, the stronger this conviction became. Days turned into weeks as Jim continued to grapple with these enigmatic visions. They now came to him at night when he lay awake, his mind a jumble of disjointed scenes and faces. Sometimes they played out like old home movies. Other times they felt eerily real, with sounds and smells so vivid that he could almost reach out and touch them. One particular recollection stood out from the rest, a woman's anguished cry as she held her dying child in her arms. The scene was bathed in a soft blue light, but Jim recognized the anguish on her face all too well. This memory felt different, raw, painful, and unfiltered by any veil of technology or encryption. As he lay there in the darkness, his heart pounding from the intensity of this vision, a sudden clarity washed over him. The neural implant wasn't just recording his surroundings. It was tapping into something much deeper, a collective consciousness that transcended the boundaries of time and space. Jim knew then that he had to investigate further to unravel the mysteries hidden within these memories and confront whatever dark forces were at play. This decision filled him with a mix of dread and resolve, as if a part of him already understood what he would eventually discover: that his implant was more than just a tool for enhancing cognition. It was a window into a world of deceit and corruption. With renewed determination, Jim began digging through the data stored on his device. He combed through logs of encrypted communications, searching for patterns or mentions of specific events that could help him connect the dots between these disparate memories. Though he found nothing concrete at first, his persistence slowly yielded results. A handful of cryptic messages and codes that hinted at something sinister lurking beneath the surface. These discoveries sent a chill down Jim's spine as he realized the full extent of what he had stumbled upon. The healthcare conglomerate wasn't just involved in fraudulent practices. They were complicit in a much larger scheme, one that spanned across multiple industries, governments, and borders. The very technology meant to improve lives was being used to manipulate and control them. Neither option appealed to him, but he also couldn't bring himself to abandon those whose lives were being destroyed by this conspiracy. With a heavy heart, Jim made up his mind he would proceed with caution, always mindful of the dangers that lay ahead, but he wouldn't back down until justice was served and the guilty parties brought to light. He owed it to himself and to all those who had suffered at the hands of these criminals. The weight of this responsibility settled upon him like a shroud as he turned off his device, knowing full well what the road ahead would entail. His body might be weak, but his spirit was unbreakable, and he was ready to fight for a cause much greater than himself. The question now was, what secrets still lay hidden within the neural implant's encrypted recesses, waiting to be uncovered? And how far would he have to go to ensure that those responsible were held accountable? Only time and his unwavering resolve would tell. The days blended together in a haze of pain, uncertainty, and relentless curiosity. Each time Jim accessed the encrypted memories, he uncovered more evidence of the conglomerate's nefarious activities. He learned about bribes paid to physicians, falsified test results manipulated by company insiders, and lives ruined by ineffective or dangerous treatments sold at exorbitant prices. The enormity of the scandal both horrified him and filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Jim knew his own life was nearing its end, but he could still make a difference before he left this world behind. He just had to be careful not to reveal too much too soon. Dr. Taylor and her colleagues were already suspicious about his prolonged recovery time. To keep up appearances, Jim reluctantly agreed to resume his participation in the trial. Though his condition continued to deteriorate rapidly, his body was failing him, muscles weakened, organs struggled, and his mind grew foggy with confusion. Yet he persevered, driven by a fierce determination to expose those responsible for this human suffering. The images were blurry and fragmented, but there was no mistaking the figures of Olivia Reed, Dr. Taylor's colleague, and others from within the conglomerate. They spoke of sensitive documents being hidden away in secure digital vaults and physical safes scattered throughout their offices. A chilling thought crossed Jim's mind. Could the implant be more than just a neural interface? Could it have been designed to record not only his surroundings but also his own thoughts, dreams, even his deepest fears? He shuddered at the prospect of being an unwitting pawn in this sinister game. The stakes had never been higher. As he delved deeper into these encrypted memories, Jim uncovered something that made his blood run cold. There was a specific document he'd seen repeatedly, a detailed blueprint outlining an elaborate cover-up operation. It described how key executives would be coached to deny any wrongdoing, discredit whistleblowers like himself, and shift the blame onto lower-level employees. In a moment of clarity, Jim realized that he held the missing piece in this puzzle, the evidence needed to bring the corporation down. And yet, he also understood the risks involved. If Dr. Taylor or her associates discovered his true intentions, they wouldn't hesitate to silence him permanently. His life was already hanging by a thread, but now it seemed like he had no choice but to take an even bigger gamble. Jim knew that once he started down this path, there would be no turning back. He had to confront Dr. Taylor and demand answers while still keeping his ultimate goal concealed from her and the others. It was time for him to put on a brave face, to feign ignorance and play along with their scheme. But beneath it all, Jim's heart raced with anticipation of what lay ahead. The next day, as he prepared himself for another meeting with Dr. Taylor, Jim felt an unsettling sense of calm wash over him. He had made his decision. Now there was no turning back. With each breath, he steeled himself for the confrontation to come, a battle that would decide not only his own fate, but also the lives of countless others who had been affected by this monstrous conspiracy. With a heavy heart and a resolute spirit, Jim waited for Dr. Taylor to arrive, knowing full well what words they were about to exchange and the unpredictable turn his life was about to take next. The question remained, would he be able to keep his secret hidden long enough to expose the truth before it was too late? Only time would tell. Dr. Victoria Taylor entered Jim's hospital room, her demeanor as serene as ever. She smiled warmly at him before pulling a chair up beside his bed. "Jim, we need to talk," she said softly. "I know there had been some concerns about your progress in the trial." Jim nodded slightly, keeping his expression neutral despite the turmoil brewing inside him. "Concerns? I don't understand what you mean, Doctor." "Don't play dumb with me, Jim. You've been asking too many questions, snooping around files that aren't your concern. You're getting too close to the truth." Jim's heart skipped a beat as he met her gaze directly for the first time since she'd walked in. A chill ran down his spine at the intensity in her eyes, yet he refused to back down. "I'm just trying to understand what this implant is doing to me," he said calmly, choosing each word with care. "I want to cooperate fully, but I need answers." Dr. Taylor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Jim felt his resolve harden like stone. "I'll do whatever it takes to understand my situation," Jim insisted, his voice steady and firm. "I deserve that much. So either I get honest answers, or I walk out of this trial right now." Dr. Taylor's face twisted in a snarl, revealing the true monster beneath her polished facade. "Fine, have it your way then. You'll regret this, Jim Lawson," she spat before storming out of the room. Jim watched her go, his mind racing with the implications of their exchange. He had crossed a line and he knew the consequences would be dire. But he was beyond caring about that now. His focus was singular, uncover the truth no matter what it took. As Olivia Reed, the conglomerate's legal representative, entered the room an hour later, Jim sensed another storm brewing on the horizon. He steeled himself for whatever she had come to say. "Jim Larson," she began without preamble, her tone cold and detached. "We've reviewed your recent actions and are extremely concerned about your behavior in this trial. Your constant questioning and interference with our processes is unacceptable." "I'm not interfering. I'm trying to understand what's happening to me," Jim countered, keeping his voice even despite the unease churning inside him. Olivia snorted derisively. "Your naivety is appalling. You're jeopardizing this entire trial, and by extension, your health with your foolishness." Jim felt a surge of anger at her dismissive attitude, but he tamped it down, choosing instead to adopt an air of quiet resignation. "Then what do you propose I do? Ignore the strange occurrences and continue as if everything is fine?" "Exactly," Olivia replied briskly. "You need to drop this nonsense about conspiracy theories and focus on your treatment. The sooner you comply, the better for everyone involved." Jim's jaw clenched involuntarily at her words. He knew they were attempting to intimidate him into silence, but he refused to back down. "I'll do what I think is right," Jim stated firmly, meeting Olivia's gaze head-on. "And if that means exposing the truth, no matter how inconvenient it may be for your company, then so be it." Olivia paled slightly at his words before regaining her composure. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Larson. We have legal recourse to silence you permanently should you continue down this path." Her threat hung in the air like a shadow over Jim's fragile existence. Jim felt his blood run cold as he realized just how high the stakes had become. He was on the brink of losing everything: his health, his reputation, even his life for a cause that seemed increasingly futile against such formidable foes. And yet, he couldn't turn back now. The truth mattered too much. With a heavy heart and a resolute spirit, Jim prepared himself for whatever lay ahead, knowing that the battle for justice was far from over. What would be the next step in Jim's quest to uncover the truth? Would Olivia and the conglomerate succeed in silencing him permanently, or would he find a way to expose their sinister activities before it was too late? Lawyers, but her brazen threats still took him aback. "Silence me permanently," he repeated, testing the weight of those words on his tongue. The room fell silent, punctuated only by the steady beep of the machines monitoring Jim's vitals. He could practically hear Olivia's mind racing behind her composed facade, weighing the risks and benefits of such a drastic step. But Jim knew she was not one to back down from a challenge. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Olivia spoke again. "Mr. Larson, I understand your desire for truth, but you're dealing with powerful forces here. We will do everything in our power to protect our interests and reputations." Jim snorted derisively. "Your company has already destroyed countless lives in its pursuit of profits. You've falsified records, bribed doctors, and exploited vulnerable patients, all while hiding behind the veneer of innovation. And now you want to silence me too. I won't let that happen without a fight." With those words, Jim knew he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He could already feel his body weakening under the strain of the implant and his own rebellious thoughts. But it was too late to turn back now. His conscience would not allow it. Olivia's expression hardened further as she reached for her phone. "I'm going to report this conversation to my superiors," she warned, "and have you institutionalized for your own safety until we can sort out these delusions." Before Jim could respond, his door burst open and a team of heavily armed security officers marched in. Without hesitation, they moved toward him with the intent to subdue. "Jim, no!" Dr. Taylor cried out, but it was too late. The men were upon him, pinning him down as he struggled futilely against their brute strength. Panic seized his chest as he realized his fate was sealed. But then, a sudden surge of defiance coursed through Jim's veins. Even as they injected him with sedatives and dragged him away, he knew that this was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a desperate gambit to expose the truth at any cost. In his mind's eye, Jim could already see the files, the records, the memories encrypted or not all waiting to be unearthed. He envisioned the conglomerate's empire crumbling beneath the weight of its own deceit. And through it all, he pictured himself as a lone figure standing tall against the tide of corruption, even in death. The question now was whether his determination could somehow transcend the confines of the neural implant and find its way out into the world, a message of truth and courage that would reverberate long after he was gone. Only time would tell. But for Jim Lawson, there was no turning back. The die had been cast. And so, as the security officers carted him away to God knows where, Jim clung to the faint glimmer of hope that his story might yet be told, a beacon of light piercing through the darkness, illuminating a path forward for all those who would dare follow. For in the face of overwhelming odds and mortal peril, what mattered most was not living, but leaving behind a legacy that would outlive him forever. The end is near, Jim thought grimly as the world around him began to blur and fade away. But so is the truth, and if he had to sacrifice everything to see it through, then so be it. Let the record show, Jim Lawson fought for what was right until his dying breath, and in that fight he discovered a strength he never knew he possessed. The hospital room had grown increasingly unsettling for Jim, as if the sterile whiteness of its walls were a reflection of the moral vacuum that now surrounded him. The beeping machines and tubes snaking across his body seemed to mock his futile struggle against an enemy he couldn't even identify, a silent assassin cloaked in technological wizardry. He knew it was only a matter of time before his body succumbed to whatever insidious forces were at work, eroding the very foundation of his humanity. It was as if the neural implant had become a cancerous growth inside him, feeding on fear and doubt while slowly extinguishing every flicker of hope he possessed. Despite this grim reality, Jim found himself staring intently at the reflection in the hospital mirror. The man who had once been so confident, so full of life. Now his face looked gaunt, eyes sunken into dark pits of exhaustion. Even his hair seemed to have lost its luster, hanging limp and lifeless against his skull like a dying plant. Yet still he clung to his convictions, though they now felt like the flimsy threads of a spider's web, ready to snap at any moment under the weight of despair. He could sense that his investigation had awakened something far more sinister than mere greed or malice, a malevolent force bent on protecting its own interests by whatever means necessary. In that moment, Jim knew he had reached a crossroads, the last chance to turn back before it was too late. But he refused to abandon the quest for justice, no matter how perilous the path ahead. For if his life held any true meaning, then it must be in exposing the darkness that threatened to consume everything dear and good. He took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of resolve within him, and reached for the small notebook he had managed to smuggle past hospital security. The pages were filled with cryptic notes and half-baked ideas, the fragmented remnants of his desperate attempts to unravel the mystery hidden inside the neural implant. As he pored over the scribbled musings, a single word leapt out from the chaos: back door. In that instant, an epiphany struck him, a solution to the impossible puzzle that had haunted him for weeks. He knew what he needed to do next, but it would require more than courage. It demanded a level of recklessness bordering on madness. With shaking hands, Jim began to write a new plan, his last stand against a foe that seemed invincible, yet still somehow within his grasp. It was time to confront the enemy head-on, no matter how lethal the trap might be or how slender the chances of survival. As he wrote, the world around him receded into silence. The constant hum of machines, the distant chatter of nurses, everything fading to black as Jim surrendered himself entirely to his mission. But he knew what lay at stake, a legacy forged in fire and tempered by defiance. The notebook closed with a decisive click. It was done. The final act of rebellion had begun. All that remained now was for Jim Lawson to step out into the void, ready or not. And so he reached for the call button on his bed rail, one last desperate plea for help that would seal his fate forever. The soft ding of the call button echoed through the hospital room as Jim's finger tightened around it. His heart raced, each beat like a hammer in his chest, faster and more erratic by the second. The nurses had come and gone all day, administering treatments that brought only fleeting relief from the pain and disorientation that now consumed him. He glanced down at the crumpled notebook on his lap, the pages torn out, scattered across the bedsheets like confetti blown by a tempest. He'd written it all out in stark black ink, his plan to breach the impenetrable fortress of data guarded by the conglomerate's executives. The machines around him beeped and whirred in response to his erratic vitals, the monitors warning nurses of impending collapse. But Jim ignored them, too focused on the task at hand. This was it, the moment he'd been building toward for months. He had to seize control before it was too late. A faint chime sounded from the doorway as a pair of blue scrubs emerged into view, a tall figure, with a stethoscope dangling around his neck. A doctor, perhaps? Jim couldn't be sure, his vision blurred by fatigue and desperation. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. "Dr. Taylor," he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. "Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself." He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. "I have a task for you," he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. The doctor's face was a mask of concern as she hurried to the bedside. Jim, what are you doing? You know better than to strain yourself. He managed a weak smile at her worried expression, a grim irony given his own state. I have a task for you, he said, the words tumbling out in fits and starts. Dr. Taylor, he croaked out in a hoarse whisper. Dr. Taylor's gaze sharpened, a glimmer of curiosity flicking across her features before she masked it once again. What are you talking about, Jim? You need to focus on your health, not conspiracy theories. Then why does Olivia Reed keep threatening me? He demanded, frustration and fear warring in his voice. The doctor's expression softened an almost imperceptible shift from skepticism to concern. "Jim, Olivia's just doing her job. She has no reason to want you harmed." "That's not true," Jim insisted, the conviction in his tone leaving no room for doubt. "She knows what I've uncovered, and she'll stop at nothing to silence me permanently if it means protecting them." Dr. Taylor reached out, placing a gentle hand on Jim's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt like a betrayal given her role as a corporate representative. "Jim, we need to think about your safety and the implant," she urged. Jim shook his head stubbornly, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "The implant is just a tool, a means to expose the truth before I die." Dr. Taylor's eyes widened at his words, the gravity of which finally began to sink in as realization dawned across her features. "Jim, listen to me," she said softly, her voice tinged with urgency and compassion. "Whatever it is you think you've discovered, it doesn't have to be this way. We can work through it together. There are ways to expose corruption without risking your life." Jim's grip on the notebook pages tightened as he stared back at her, the weight of his decision hanging precariously in balance. Part of him yearned for Dr. Taylor's reassurance to surrender himself to her care and let her navigate this treacherous landscape, but another part, a darker, more determined part, knew that it was already too late. He'd crossed the line into rebellion, and there was no turning back now. "I appreciate your concern," he said quietly, as much a farewell as an acceptance of her offer, "but I've made my choice." With those words hanging in the air between them, Jim's hand found the call button once more, the sound that would seal his fate, a cry for help, laced with defiance and a desperate resolve to take down the behemoth he'd uncovered from within. The world around him faded into darkness, his heart pounding wildly like a drumbeat in the silence as he waited for the inevitable response. And his final act of rebellion began. The room's fluorescent lights flickered ominously as Jim waited for a response, his chest heaving with each labored breath. Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity, as he lay there, exposed and vulnerable, yet defiantly still holding on to his secret. Finally, the door swung open and Olivia Reed strode in, her face a mask of icy composure, but her eyes betraying a flash of something far more sinister, rage. Well, she drawled, her voice dripping with venom. "Looks like our brave whistleblower has finally succumbed to his own weakness." She paused, allowing the full weight of her words to sink in. "You should have taken my advice earlier, Jim. You see, we knew about your little research project. Every keystroke, every click, monitored and recorded with precision." Jim's eyes widened as shock gave way to horror. So that was why he'd noticed his online activities had been unusually slow. It wasn't just the hospital Wi-Fi, but something far more insidious. They were tracing him. "How?" His voice trailed off as Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Does it matter? You see, Jim," she continued, her tone growing colder with each word, "your decision to leak our files has already been rendered obsolete by us. We've taken the necessary precautions. There's no evidence left behind for anyone to find." Her smile was a cruel mockery as she watched Jim's face crumple in despair. "But you're not just going down alone, Lawson," Olivia added with a predatory gleam in her eye. "We know about your family, your wife, your children. They'll pay the price for your treachery too." The threat hung in the air like a noose tightening around Jim's neck, the ultimate weapon to silence him once and for all. Yet even as fear clawed its way up his throat, Jim found an ember of defiance still flickering deep within his resolve to expose the truth unbroken. He knew he was running out of time. Olivia's words had made that abundantly clear. While his physical body might be failing him, Jim's mind remained sharp and focus-driven by a desperate hope to leave behind a trail of breadcrumbs for others to follow after he was gone. He had one final card up his sleeve, one last act of rebellion before the darkness consumed him entirely. With a Herculean effort, he summoned every ounce of strength left within himself and spoke the words that would set everything in motion, the beginning of the end game. "Go ahead," Jim whispered, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic beep of machines surrounding him. "Do your worst. But know this, I've already planted the seed. It will grow, and when it does, you won't be able to stop its spread." His eyes locked onto Olivia's, cold, defiant, and utterly resolute as he added, his voice now a mere thread of sound. "Remember my name and the truth I leave behind." Jim Larson wasn't just a whistleblower. He was the spark that ignited justice. With those final words echoing through the sterile hospital room, Jim Larson slipped away into oblivion, a martyr to the cause he'd embraced with every fiber of his being, leaving Olivia Reed and her corporate overlords staring at an abyss they could no longer control. The world would soon learn about their crimes. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, and when it did, Jim's sacrifice would be immortalized in the annals of history as a beacon of hope for those who dared to challenge the powerful and fight for justice against all odds. The days that followed Jim's death were a blur of legal maneuvering, media frenzy, and corporate damage control. Olivia Reed and her associates worked tirelessly to discredit his claims and keep the scandal contained, but it was an uphill battle. Journalists who had received anonymous tips from whistleblowers began sniffing around, and investigators with a mandate to clean house within the healthcare conglomerate were soon hot on their heels. As the news tightened around them, Olivia found herself increasingly isolated. Even her former colleagues at the law firm appeared reluctant to offer her legal counsel now that her clients' reputations, and in some cases their freedom, hung in the balance. She was left to fend for herself against a tide of public opinion and official scrutiny. Meanwhile, Dr. Taylor had vanished from sight, apparently opting for a low profile until the storm passed. Her absence only fueled speculation about her involvement in Jim's death and the conspiracy he'd uncovered. Some claimed she'd been silenced permanently. Others speculated that she was already cooperating with authorities, providing crucial testimony against her former employer. Against this backdrop of chaos and recrimination, Olivia received a late-night call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously, expecting another journalist or investigator looking for a quote. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with the ghost of Jim Larson, a man who'd been dead for only a few weeks, yet seemed to haunt her every waking moment. "I've left you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but eerily clear over the phone line. "It's all I have left, my final act of defiance against those who would misuse power and destroy lives." Olivia felt a chill run down her spine as Jim continued to speak, detailing the contents of an encrypted folder he'd created before his death, the culmination of months spent compiling evidence of fraud and misconduct within the healthcare conglomerate. "In this digital safe, you'll find everything I've uncovered: records of falsified medical documents, kickbacks to doctors, cover-ups of patient deaths," Jim explained. "I've also included my own memories, the encrypted files Dr. Taylor created without my knowledge or consent. They will reveal the truth about her involvement and expose the rot that's festered at the heart of your organization." Olivia listened in growing horror as Jim laid out his plan. The folder, he said, would be transferred to a secure server under an anonymous alias, someone she knew well enough to trust but wouldn't suspect of betraying her company. "You have 72 hours, Jim warned, before I release the contents of this folder to every major news outlet and regulatory agency in the country. Use that time to come clean about everything or face the consequences when the truth comes out." As the call ended, Olivia felt her world crumbling around her. She'd always prided herself on being unflappable under pressure. But now she found herself facing an impossible choice: risk everything by fighting a losing battle, or sacrifice her career and reputation to salvage what remained of her client's integrity. The next few days were a blur of activity as Olivia frantically tried to shore up the conglomerate's defenses. She hired teams of lawyers and public relations specialists to craft damage control strategies, but it was clear that their efforts would be for naught if Jim's evidence saw the light of day. As the deadline loomed closer, Olivia found herself cornered by the very people she'd once represented, executives who now feared being dragged down with her. One by one, they began to throw her under the bus, claiming that she alone had orchestrated the fraud and cover-ups in an attempt to save their own jobs. With time running out and her future on the line, Olivia knew that her only hope lay in convincing anyone to believe her story and intervene before it was too late. But as she gazed at the encrypted folder sitting ominously on her desk, a tangible reminder of Jim Larson's vengeful legacy, the weight of her predicament felt crushing. Just then, there was a knock at the door, and Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She looked up to find a young woman standing in the threshold, a stranger whose name she'd never heard before, but whose eyes held a knowing glint that sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm here about Jim Lawson," the woman said calmly, stepping into the room with an air of quiet authority. "And I think it's time we started cleaning up this mess together." "What do you mean, cleaning up this mess?" "I know everything," replied the woman bluntly. "From Jim's trial to his whistleblowing. All of it." Olivia's mind raced as she tried to assess the stranger's intentions. Could this be another corporate spy or a journalist looking for an exclusive? Perhaps even someone from the government probing into their operation. We can preemptively discredit his evidence. Olivia hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. She had to think strategically now, and this woman might just be her key to survival. "Okay," Olivia agreed cautiously. "Let's hear your plan." The woman nodded in approval. "First, I'll need to access Jim's files and recordings. Once I have that information, we can begin planting seeds of doubt about its authenticity and reliability." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting a smear campaign?" "It's not ideal," the woman conceded, "but time is short, and it might just buy us enough breathing room to find another solution." As Olivia contemplated this approach, she couldn't shake off the feeling that her new ally was hiding more than they were revealing. But what choice did she have? With the noose tightening around her neck, even a risky alliance seemed worth exploring. The woman continued outlining her plan as Olivia listened intently, her mind already racing with countermeasures and potential fallout from such a move. And when it was all said and done, as they finalized the details of their unholy pact and parted ways with vague promises of future contact, Olivia couldn't help but wonder what price she'd ultimately pay for her survival in this treacherous game where Jim's ghostly presence continued to haunt every corner, ever watchful and unforgiving. The woman vanished from Olivia's sight as quickly as she appeared, leaving behind only a faint scent of lavender and the echo of her enigmatic voice. The corporate lawyer was left to ponder the implications of their clandestine meeting, a dangerous dalliance that threatened to tarnish her once spotless reputation. Olivia leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling as she mentally replayed every word spoken during their brief encounter. She needed time to process this new development, to consider its ramifications and devise a strategy to mitigate any potential fallout. But first things first, she had to act swiftly to protect herself before the woman's plan could take root. With a swift keystroke, Olivia initiated a secure email to her colleagues, outlining the situation and issuing instructions for damage control. She requested they dig up everything possible on the mysterious woman. Their contacts would surely know more about this shadowy figure who had so brazenly insinuated herself into their midst. In the meantime, Olivia decided it was time to revisit Jim Larson's final resting place, to pay her respects and perhaps glean some solace from his unwavering conviction. She navigated through the labyrinth of corporate offices until she reached the quiet garden courtyard hidden behind a row of potted ferns, a secret oasis where employees could find refuge amidst the chaos of their daily lives. As Olivia approached Jim's memorial stone, an odd sensation crept over her like a chill running down her spine. She glanced around but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Still, that unsettling feeling persisted, a nagging sense that she was being watched. Suddenly, Olivia noticed a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye, a woman with long dark hair and a black coat blending seamlessly into the shadows. There was something vaguely familiar about this apparition, yet Olivia couldn't quite place it. Without warning, The woman stepped forward, her features illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the garden's trellised archways. Olivia felt her heart skip a beat as she realized that this ghostly figure bore an uncanny resemblance to Dr. Victoria Taylor, the neuroscientist who had once worked alongside Jim. "What are you doing here?" Olivia demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing unease in her gut. The woman's silence was unnerving, almost as if she were waiting for something to happen, a cue from some unseen force. And then, as if on a signal neither of them could hear, the woman began to speak in a low, measured tone that sent shivers down Olivia's spine. "I am the guardian of Jim Larson's legacy. I am the key to unlocking his most profound discovery, the secret he took to his grave." Her words dripped with an otherworldly authority, a chilling command that left Olivia feeling helpless and exposed. The lawyer's mind raced, her thoughts scattering like leaves in a hurricane as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. She had heard whispers about Dr. Taylor's involvement in Jim's research, but nothing could have prepared her for this surreal confrontation, a spectral apparition bearing secrets of the dead man's final endeavors. "And you?" Olivia managed to stammer, forcing herself to confront the ethereal presence before her. "Who are you really?" "I am the embodiment of his deepest convictions, the conduit through which he will live on," Dr. Taylor replied with a faint smile, as if sharing a precious secret only known to them both. Olivia's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Was this woman truly a ghost, or merely some devious impostor using Jim's death for nefarious purposes? She couldn't afford to take any chances, not when her career and future hung in the balance. "So help me, Dr. Taylor. If you are indeed who I think you are, you will not leave until we've settled this matter once and for all," Olivia warned, her voice firm yet laced with a growing dread. The ghostly figure nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes locked onto Olivia's, their gazes entwined in a silent battle of wills. It was as if they were engaged in a high-stakes game contest where one misstep could prove fatal to both their reputations and perhaps even their lives. And so the standoff continued, each woman waiting for the other to make the first move. As the moon climbed higher in the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the secluded courtyard, the stage upon which this deadly drama would unfold settled. The question remained. Would it be Olivia, the cunning corporate lawyer, or Dr. Taylor, the ghostly guardian of Jim's legacy? Only time and perhaps a dash of fate would tell. The night air was heavy with tension as Olivia and Dr. Taylor remained locked in their silent confrontation, neither willing to back down from the high-stakes standoff. The ghostly doctor's ethereal presence seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy that made Olivia's skin crawl, yet she refused to show fear. Drawing strength from her unyielding resolve, Olivia pressed on. "You're playing a dangerous game, Dr. Taylor," Olivia warned, her voice steady despite the growing sense of unease creeping up her spine. "If you're indeed Jim's widow or some other associate of his, then why not prove it? Why continue to haunt me with these cryptic messages?" She paused, studying Dr. Taylor intently. "Unless you're not what you claim to be." The spectral figure didn't flinch at Olivia's accusation, the very notion of deception hanging between them like a challenge. But then, without warning, the ghostly doctor began to fade away, her luminous form growing dimmer as she slowly disappeared into thin air. Olivia blinked hard, wondering if she had merely imagined the whole encounter, that is, until she felt an icy touch on her wrist. Turning quickly, she found herself face to face with Dr. Taylor once more, this time solid and tangible as flesh and blood. "So, you can manifest at will," Olivia remarked coolly, trying to hide the shock from her voice. "I take it this means I'm not imagining things." She arched an eyebrow, studying Dr. Taylor with newfound interest. The doctor nodded gravely, her eyes filled with a deep sadness that tugged on Olivia's heartstrings. "No, you're perceiving reality as it truly is," she replied softly. "At least as far as I'm concerned." Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine as the implications sank in. Their conversation was no longer just a product of Olivia's fevered imagination or some clever ruse. Dr. Taylor was real, very much so, and had a message to deliver that could potentially change everything. "What is it?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper now as she leaned forward, eager to hear what secrets the ghostly doctor might reveal next. Dr. Taylor took a deep breath and began to speak in a hushed tone. Jim's final act of defiance wasn't just about leaking evidence, the folder he left behind. It contained something more. Olivia's eyes widened with anticipation. What? Tell me, what else did he discover? He uncovered proof that the conglomerate had been experimenting on unwilling patients, using them as test subjects for untested drugs and treatments. Dr. Taylor revealed, her voice laced with disgust and horror. An atrocity. "What does this mean?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling with emotion now. "The executives will face charges, I'm sure of that. But what about the countless lives ruined by their inhuman experiments? What about those who still suffer today?" Dr. Taylor's gaze softened, filled with a deep empathy for all those affected. Jim wanted to bring justice not only to the corrupt few, but also hope and healing to the many who've been hurt. She said gently, "He believed that by exposing the truth, we could start rebuilding lives, restoring dignity where it was stolen." Olivia's eyes welled up with tears as she felt a surge of admiration for Jim Larson, the man she had once seen only as an adversary, but now understood to be so much more, a true champion of justice and humanity. In that moment, Olivia knew what needed to be done. "What can I do?" Olivia asked, her voice filled with determination. "How can I help ensure that his legacy lives on?" Dr. Taylor smiled weakly, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Olivia, you've already begun by listening, by being willing to confront the truth," she replied. "Your role now is to be Jim's advocate, a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves." With renewed purpose and a deep sense of responsibility, Olivia nodded solemnly. Together, they would fight to make things right, to hold accountable those who had abused power and betrayed trust, and to help heal the wounds left in their wake. As the night wore on and the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, Dr. Taylor vanished once more, this time without fanfare or explanation. But Olivia knew that she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. She would continue Jim's fight against injustice, armed with the knowledge he had entrusted her, with the truth about the conglomerate's dark secrets and the courage to expose them. In the days and weeks ahead, as Olivia delved deeper into the heart of the conspiracy, she encountered more than just evidence of wrongdoing. She discovered a community of survivors, each with their own harrowing stories of abuse and betrayal. And through it all, Jim Larson remained at her side, a silent guardian whose spirit infused her work with an unyielding sense of purpose. Together, Olivia and the countless victims whose lives had been shattered by corporate greed forged a new path forward, one built on truth, accountability, and healing. As his legacy grew, so did their resolve, and in time, it would become clear to all that Jim Larson's final act of defiance had unleashed a revolution, the power of one person to change the world when driven by courage and moral conviction.